welcome to Crime Bytes, a show where we talk about some truly bizarre and disturbing crime cases. My name is Liz, and today is True Crime Tuesday. Happy New Year, everyone. I'm not going to lie. This year isn't feeling all that fresh and shiny and exciting to me. I don't really know why either. Usually, I don't know, I can catch that excitement more than I am this year. But Happy New Year, it's 2025, let's go. I gotta find something to light my fire, clearly. I've been low-key thinking about getting one of those like human reptile lights for the winters up here. I know that's not what they're really called, but do any of you guys use one of those? And if so, do they work? Stay tuned, maybe next year. And I know I've been plugging snow for the past 2 weeks, but it felt like the right promotion for New Year's. You know, with all the new year, new me excitement, why not treat yourself to a new smile? Couldn't help myself there. Maybe not a new smile, but a brighter smile. And snow is probably number one right now for affordable teeth whitening. But don't just take my word for it. Click my link in the description and try snow today for an additional 15% off. I tried them for the first time 3 years ago, a little bit skeptical and hopeful, and I would say that they have exceeded my expectations. So I'm really happy to still be using them for touch-ups and now promoting them. I just went through a pack of their diamond dissolving strips for a little boost for New Year's, and it was neat. I wasn't really sure what to think with the dissolving strips because I've never done anything like that before, but yeah, you stick them and it feels kind of neat. They kind of foam up a little bit and then they're gone, and you don't have to pull them off like the old kind, and they leave your mouth feeling fresh. So what are you waiting for? Click on my link and get 15% off of your new smile. And let's get back to today's story. So how many of you guys saw Woman of the Hour? I really like Anna Kendrick, and I've had Rodney Alcala on my list since I've started this channel. So when I found out about the movie, I kind of tried to hold off watching it until I was ready to cover his story. So, so it was kind of fresh. And this past week, I just couldn't wait and I watched it. So yeah, we're going to talk about Rodney Alcala today. And Woman of the Hour explored the story of Cheryl Bradshaw, a struggling actress who reluctantly books a spot on the dating game where she picks the bachelor who turns out to be a serial killer. And yes, it's based on a true story. So the dating game was a game show that first premiered on December 20th of 1965, and the original show ran from then until 1973 when it was dropped. It would be revived and then re-revived, and our story takes place within the first reboot of the show, which took place from 1978 to 1980. The show would feature a bachelorette who would sit down on one side of a partition, and then 3 bachelors would come and sit on the other side so that they couldn't see one another. After that, the bachelorette would have a series of questions to ask them, and when she was done, she had to pick a bachelor to go on an all-expenses-paid date with, based solely off of his answers to her questions. Sounds like fun, right? I don't know. It sounds interesting, and like it could go great, but like a lot of things could go really wrong as well. Today's case in point. It was a super popular show and even had big names like Sally Fields and Steve Martin as contestants. But in 1978, they would cast a serial killer as one of the bachelors, and the bachelorette would choose him. How does that happen? I mean, obviously in 1978, we didn't have background checks like we do today. So there was more room for stuff like this to go down. So let's meet bachelor number 1, Rodney Alcala. Rodney Alcala was born on August 23rd of 1943 in San Antonio, Texas, to Raul Alcala and Ana Marie Gutierrez. In 1951, Raul decided it might be better for his family if they moved back to Mexico. It's said that he did this because he thought he could give them a better life there where he grew up, but also because his mother was growing old and wanted to move back there for her final years. But when they got there, after his mother had passed on, he straight up abandoned his family. So he moved his family to Mexico, and then he left them there to fend for themselves. 3 years later, in 1954, Ana Marie would move them to Los Angeles when Rodney was 11, and he would finish growing up there. In 1961, he would enlist in the U.S. Army as a clerk, and he would do that until 1964 when he would go AWOL from Fort Bragg and ended up at his mother's house. It was documented as a nervous breakdown, and he was diagnosed with severe antisocial personality disorder and medically discharged. That's a pretty significant and heavy diagnosis. He would continue to attend UCLA's School of Fine Arts and end up with a Bachelor's of Fine Arts in 1968. This year is also significant because that August, fresh out of college, he would brutally attack 16-year-old Morgan Rowan. He picked her up at a nightclub and got her and a couple of her friends into his car by saying that he would bring them to IHOP, but instead he drove back to his apartment. He brought her inside and locked her inside of his bedroom, took a metal bar and put it across the door frame, and then took his belt off and wrapped it around his fist. Morgan would try and tell him he couldn't keep her there, and he would punch her right between the eyes as hard as he could before brutally assaulting her. Thankfully, her friends were able to break one of the windows in that bedroom and stop the attack. Rodney would just flee from the scene. Then that September, he would abduct 8-year-old Tali Shapiro. Tali was walking to school when a car pulled up next to her, and a man inside asked if he could give her a ride. Tali politely said no and changed her mind when the man said that he knew her parents. Luckily, a passing motorist observed this exchange and thought enough about it to call the police. The police would respond and at first knocked on the door, but something told them that they had to get in there, so they slammed it in, almost in Rodney's face, which unfortunately allowed him just enough time to bolt out the back and escape. They would find poor Tali in a pool of her own blood, naked, with a steel bar pressed up against her neck in Rodney's kitchen. When they moved the bar, she gagged, so she was still alive, and they would rush her to the hospital, and she would remain in a coma for 32 days, but she would end up making a full recovery after many more months in the hospital. In the meantime, Rodney fled to the Northeast. He tried to hide in New York City, which, good plan. New York City is huge and far away from California. He ended up enrolling in NYU with the name John Berger. And he actually took a class under Roman Polanski. Anyhow, on June 12th of 1971, a flight attendant named Cornelia Crilley would either ask Rodney for help or accept his offer to help her while she was moving into a new apartment on East 83rd Street. She was found strangled with her nylons. he had assaulted her before he murdered her as well. This murder would remain unsolved until around 2011, actually, when they were able to use DNA from the scene to determine that it was, in fact, Rodney who had killed her. Isn't it crazy how when DNA evidence started growing, so many of these unsolved cases suddenly got solved? It actually played a huge role in solving a lot of the murders in today's case by linking the victims to Rodney. Anyhow, later that year, he would head to New Hampshire to work at an arts camp. This time, he changed his alias to John Berger. From Berger to Berger, with a U. In the meantime, the name Alcala was added to the FBI's list of the 10 most wanted fugitives, and a couple of months later, some of his campers would notice that John Berger looked a lot like that Alcala the FBI was looking for. Yeah, it's a scooter. The FBI agreed, let me get him some bacon, and Alcala was arrested and brought back to California. Tali Shapiro's family moved to Mexico after the attack, and it was 3 years later, and they didn't want her to have to suffer through the trial after everything that she had been through. And she was still only 11, so they ended up refusing to have her testify, which I don't disagree with them at all. I know these days we probably could do like a video testimony or something like that. But in this case, what that did was cause the prosecution to charge Rodney with child molestation instead of rape and attempted murder. And this was detrimental because it only got him a 3-year sentence, which he didn't even completely serve because he was paroled in 1974 after 34 months spent. So yeah, he almost served the whole thing, but still, he was paroled. And Tali ended up returning back to California when she was 60 and works in the food and beverage business in Palm Springs. Hey, buddy. Well, we got big bacons today. I'm gone for a bit. And obviously Rodney didn't learn his lesson because our story is not finished yet. Unfortunately, sometimes lessons like this just teach bad people how to be more careful. And unfortunately, that's just how it is. And he was up to his old tricks very fast because less than 2 months after he was paroled, he was rearrested and convicted for assaulting another young girl. This one was 13 and unidentified. This would get him another 2 years. Then he was paroled yet again in 1977 and registered as a sex offender. He would start working as a typesetter for the LA Times and a wedding photographer on the side. This would not stop him either. We're going to go over more of his known victims and the circumstances surrounding their attacks, but Rodney's MO was basically, he was that creepy cameraman looking for models. And he was smooth too, if you didn't catch that creepy vibe right away. Anyone know anyone like that? Let me take your picture, baby. Anyhow, it worked for him, and his IQ is said to have been anywhere from 130 to 160, which is very high, and I'm sure that helped too. Extremely intelligent evil people are literally the scariest. Some of his victims were confused as victims of the Hillside Strangler, Kenneth Bianchi, and he was actually a suspect for some of the Hillside Strangler's crimes. They were operating around the same time in the same area with similar MOs. So even though he was on parole, he was able to convince his parole officer to let him travel to New York. It was there that he would run into Elen Hoover. Elen had a degree in biology with a minor in music. On July 13th of 1977, Elen was observed by a friend of hers talking to a man fitting Rodney's description outside of her apartment building. Her friend would later ask her about it, and Elen would tell her that he was a photographer who really wanted to take pictures of her. She didn't really want to, but he seemed like a nice guy, even if he was a little pushy, so she would end up agreeing. And she would meet up for lunch with him a few days later, and she would never be seen again. And the name John Berger, photographer, would be seen in her appointment book for July 15th. About a year later, her body would be found near the Hudson River. Then, on November 9th of 1977, 18-year-old Jill Terry Barcomb was found strangled with blue rope ties and left in a dirt path right outside of Los Angeles. She was also sexually assaulted and one of the victims that was originally thought to have been killed by the Hillside Strangler, but later attributed to Rodney Alcala. On December 16th of that year, 27-year-old Georgia Marie Wixted was found assaulted and strangled with her nylons in her Malibu apartment. She worked as a nurse, and she was supposed to bring one of her coworkers to work the next day. So when she didn't show up to do that or for work either, her coworker reported her missing. There were signs of a forced entry and a sexual assault. Her murder was also ultimately pinned to Alcala after DNA evidence started being used years later. Then we jump to June 24th of 1978 when 31-year-old legal secretary Charlotte Lee Lamb was found dead in her apartment complex's laundry room. She was sexually assaulted and strangled with a shoelace. DNA from the scene would be matched to Rodney, and Lamb's DNA would be found on an earring that Rodney had kept as a trophy. So we have a few victims here that for the time being, no one knew Rodney was a killer. At this point, he was just a convicted pedophile who had been on the FBI's most wanted list, and yet this is the point where we pause in the middle of the list of Rodney's known victims, because on September 13th of 1978 is when Rodney would make his appearance on The Dating Game as a convicted pedophile. I still can't get over that, but yeah, like I said, they didn't have background checks, or they clearly didn't have what we have today. They were not as thorough. Here is a clip from that show.
You feel okay? All right. You know there are 3 bachelors over there. There'll be 1, 2, and 3. Ask them anything you like to find out more about them, except their name, age, occupation, or income, okay? And we're going to start by having them say hello to you and see how they sound. Number 1, would you say hello to Cheryl, please?
We're going to have a great time together, Cheryl.
Okay. And here we go.
Bachelor number 1.
Yes.
What's your best time?
The best time is at night, nighttime,
Why do you say that?
because that's the only time there is.
The only time? What's wrong with morning, afternoon?
Well, they're okay, but nighttime's when it really gets good. Then you're really ready.
I'm a drama teacher, and I'm going to audition each of you for my private class. Bachelor number 1.
You're a dirty old man.
Take it.
Oh, come on, over here.
Oh, honey, we ought to go out and boogie.
Really?
Bachelor number 1. I am serving you for dinner.
Oh,
What are you called, and what do you look like?
I'm called the banana, and I look really good.
Can you be a little more descriptive?
Peel me.
Later, Bachelor 1, later.
Welcome back to The Dating Game, and Cheryl, we have reached the moment of truth, as we call it. You've heard from the bachelors. You got some great dramatic presentations, some good answers, but now I'm going to ask you a question. Will that date be bachelor number 1, bachelor number 2, or bachelor number 3? Who gets the dates?
Well, I like bananas, so I'll take one.
Number one. That's your number one. All right. Well, there they go. However, you did leave one remaining, and this is your date, and I want to tell you something about him, Cheryl. He's a skydiver, so he's got a lot of nerve. He's into motorcycling. He's also a fine photographer.
So the movie Woman of the Hour followed Cheryl Bradshaw as she reluctantly took a spot on the dating game, then was charmed on live TV by Rodney, and ultimately chose him for the date. In the movie, they go out for drinks after, and Cheryl catches a really creepy vibe and gives him a fake number, and he completely catches her on that, and it is so creepy. Oof. Have you ever done anything like that? They did a really good job with it. And in real life, Cheryl was a drama teacher and foot masseuse. It's unclear, but also unlikely that she and Rodney had drinks after the show, but they did interact, and it was so uncomfortable for Cheryl off camera that she asked the show's coordinator if it would be a problem if she didn't go on the prize date because of how he made her feel. She specifically said, "There's weird vibes that are coming off of him. He's very strange. I am not comfortable. Is that going to be a problem?" Then the movie had someone recognize him while he was on the show, which didn't actually happen, but Anna Kendrick would say that she designed this character to represent all of the people who tried to report Alcala and were basically ignored over the years. That's pretty deep. The movie also depicts him being caught after another encounter with a young runaway where she actually tricks him into bringing her back home by acting like everything is okay after she wakes up from his assault. They would start heading back, and Rodney would stop at a gas station to pee, and she would run to a diner next door and call the police. In real life, this was similar to what actually happened, but this event didn't stop Rodney either, because he was in fact arrested after this incident, but would be bailed out to continue his spree by his mother. So in real life, after his appearance on the dating game on February 14th of 1979, Rodney would pick up 15-year-old hitchhiker Monique Hoyt, who he would take back to his apartment and sexually assault. Then he brought her out to the mountains where he tied her up and took pictures of himself assaulting her more. Then he would smash her head with a rock. But she would still be alive and escape when he stopped at a gas station. So he stopped to use the bathroom, and she would flee and go ahead and file a police report. Rodney would be arrested, and at this point, his mother would post bail for him. I believe it was around $10,000 as well. And he was back out, and unfortunately from here, his spree would continue. He would just learn not to let his victims survive. On June 13th of 1979, 21-year-old Jill Parenteau would be found dead in her bedroom. There were signs of a forced entry, but she had been assaulted and strangled. They would identify Rodney as the killer later by his DNA, and one of Jill's friends would say that she and Jill had met Rodney a few times before at one of the clubs that they all frequented, and they had spoken to him actually on the night that Jill had disappeared. Then on June 20th of 1979, 12-year-old Robin Christine Samsoe would be found brutalized, stabbed, and strangled in the LA foothills. She was last seen riding her bicycle to her ballet class. Her friends would say that a stranger approached them and was asking to take their pictures. When detectives drew up a sketch and circulated it, Rodney's parole officer recognized him. He was brought in that July and held without bail. He was tried and found guilty in May of 1980 and sentenced to death that June. This verdict would be overturned 4 years later because the jury had not been aware of his prior sex crimes, and I mean, to me, that would solidify my verdict, but he was retried in 1986 with the jury being aware of his more terrible history, and they convicted him and resentenced him to death. His decision would be upheld until 2001 when he filed a federal habeas corpus petition and his conviction was overturned. That petition was upheld and Rodney would get a new trial. He argued something about the ranger who investigated Robin Samsoe's murder being hypnotized by the police investigators, and it ended up working. He even wrote a book, You the Jury, while waiting for his third trial, where he argued his innocence and suggested a possible other suspect for the murder. Unfortunately for Rodney, while preparing for his third trial, a new state law passed and he was mandated to give up some of his DNA for testing. And they would match it to a bunch of the victims that we mentioned earlier. So they would actually end up adding 4 victims to Robin Samsoe's case. His prosecution would try to separate them, but the judge would decide to try Rodney for the third time, but this time for 5 murders instead of just 1. And at this point, he decided to defend himself. Watch out for those. Even if he was almost a genius, unless you have law training. But Mr. Alcala was asking Mr. Alcala questions in one voice, his lawyer voice, which was deeper, and then he would answer them as himself in his normal voice. I think he even got up and down from the stand and like, Mr. Alcala, Mr. Alcala. You don't see and hear that every day. And he would only dispute Robin's murder, not the 4 other women who they had DNA evidence against him for. He would simply say that he didn't remember killing any of these women, which, okay. And they did have an earring that they found in his storage locker that belonged to Robin. It was even custom fit to her ear, so it was pretty hard to say it wasn't hers, but he tried. And finally, as part of his closing argument, he would play Arlo Guthrie's song Alice's Restaurant, which that took me down a side rabbit hole. It's like this 18-minute long song story. Apparently a lot of people listen to it on Thanksgiving. It's very folky. Such a weird, creepy genius move to play that as your closing argument, though, and I'm not sure exactly what he was trying to say, but people point to the protagonist telling the psychiatrist that he wants to kill as being significant. I wasn't familiar with the song myself, so I threw it on while I was doing the dishes, and I tried to imagine him playing it in a courtroom. Shout out to Stockbridge. But it seemed more like he was trying to poke holes at the justice system to me while kind of making a mockery of it at the same time with an 18-minute song as a closing argument. That's just my opinion, though. It's interesting to picture and a long song. So that's how he chose to represent himself. He was surprised when during the penalty phase, Tali Shapiro showed up, and at the end of her testimony, Rodney, who was still representing himself, said, "I sincerely regret and apologize for my despicable actions that day," which did not faze her, and I guess, to be fair, is better behavior than some of the killers that we've seen in court. Either way, in March of 2010, he was convicted and sentenced to death for a third time. New York would not at first pursue any of their cases against him because he was already awaiting execution, but then in 2011, a Manhattan grand jury would decide to indict him for Cornelia, Crilley, and Elen Hoover, and he would be extradited to New York, where he would plead guilty to both cases. They would also release around 120 of Rodney's photographs and try and find more of his victims. There were almost 1,000 more that couldn't be released to the public because of how explicit they were, and about 21 women would come forward to identify themselves, and about 6 families would recognize their disappeared loved ones. They are still online, and some of the cases are still cold if you are interested. One picture showed a dark-haired woman riding a motorcycle, and she was recognized as Christine Thornton, who disappeared in June of 1977 while hitchhiking. Rodney would say that he took the picture, but he didn't kill her. Her remains would be found in Sweetwater County, Wyoming in 1984, and she would be about 6 months pregnant at that time. The Seattle police would also name him as a person of interest in several cases after finding a storage locker rented by him from a receipt that they found from the initial search of his home. Inside of the locker were more pictures and jewelry worn by some of his victims that Rodney had kept as trophies. More evidence found in this locker would link him to other California cases as well. Although he was only sentenced for 7 murders, authorities believe that he may have murdered as many as 130 people, which is insane. Another really horrible thing that he would do was strangle his victims and then resuscitate them just to strangle them again. He's definitely one of the worst. And he would end up dying of a heart attack on June 24th of 2021 when he was 77 years old in the Kings County Hospital. All right, guys, that's going to do it. I knew he was bad, but I didn't know quite how bad before I dove into this one. And let's bring Scoot out for our real facts. Come here, Scooty. Come on, Bacon. Yes, good boy. Mm-hmm. Bacons. Come here. Ooh, we lose you. Oh, come on. And today's real fact is going to be, here, let's see that face. If someone's giving you that vibe, the way Cheryl felt that night with Rodney, you trust it. It could save your life. All right, he's going to jump. And let's look at some of Rodney's survivors for our positive note today. 8-year-old Tali Shapiro was hit in the back of the head right when she walked into Rodney's apartment, which is an ironic positive note because she doesn't have to remember the horrific attack that she suffered at his hands. She felt a sense of duty testifying against him at his sentencing. She thought that his apology was sickening, to be frank, and I agree with her. It feels that the world is a better place without him in it. I agree with her there too. There is actually a heartwarming story about how Tali helped Morgan Rowan on her healing journey, offering forgiveness for not, because Morgan didn't go to the police after she was attacked kind of right before Tali, and apparently that was something that she held on to for a little bit. Both women are alive and well, and that in and of itself is just amazing after they encountered a monster as terrible as Rodney. Anyhow, guys, what do you think of the movie Woman of the Hour if you saw it? I think Anna Kendrick did a really good job with the story. I really enjoyed the movie. I hope you guys all had a great first week of 2025. Here's to new beginnings, but always trust your gut and stay safe out there. Bye.